This is All India Radio. Please stand by for our next program.
This is All India Radio. You will now hear comments from the press. The Times of India, in its editorial titled The Pegasus Breach, says the Supreme Court has inquired in a case relating to the tapping of a phone of a police officer and his daughters in Chhattisgarh whether there is any such thing as privacy left in the country. The issue becomes more salient with revelations that Israeli spyware Pegasus was used to snoop on Indian politicians and activists with no clarity on the actual number of citizens whose privacy was violated. Pegasus represents a wholesale takeover of an individual's privacy and identity, courtesy the computer and the smartphone in the digital era, making older issues like phone tapping seem relatively quaint. It was this radical threat to privacy posed by the digital era that moved the Apex Court 2 years back to recognize that the constitutional rights granted to an Indian citizen also include a fundamental right to privacy. If a government uses spyware like Pegasus to spy on opposition politicians or activists, it would make the equivalent of the Watergate scandal a routine event, hollowing out democratic rights entirely. The Pegasus case thus dramatically highlights the need for laws to protect privacy. Snooping and official surveillance is, of course, justified in some instances, as when tracking potential terrorists or criminals. This end can be served by requiring a judicial order for placing someone under surveillance. The company selling Pegasus says it was sold only to officially authorized government bodies for prevention of crime and terrorism. The Indian Express, in its editorial titled Lost Opportunity, writes, after months of uncertainty, India has chosen to hold back from joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership RCEP trade agreement, turning its back on one of the most dynamic regions in the world. Certain segments which lobbied against the deal might be re-levied at the outcome, but the loss to the economy far exceeds the short-term perceived benefits of staying out of the pact. While the political rhetoric continues to center around free trade, the government's action signals a distinct shift towards a protectionist stance. Much of the domestic opposition to rejoining the RCEP is rooted in the fear that the influx of cheap Chinese products, non-tariff barriers which tend to restrict market access, and cheaper dairy products from New Zealand would worsen the already ballooning trade deficit and dent the domestic industry. To be fair, these are legitimate concerns. There are reasonable arguments to be made that certain sectors, agriculture in particular, would need safeguards, though the details of these negotiations are not yet known. The Indian side should have made greater effort to convince other countries for carve-outs for certain sectors and for allowing a gradual phasing out of tariffs to ease domestic fears. New Delhi should have used this as an opportunity to push through contentious but necessary reforms that would boost competitiveness. But by deciding not to join, it has succumbed to the protectionist impulses that have guided much of its recent trade moves. While it is possible that the deeper than expected slowdown in the economy may have tilted the balance in favor of not joining, a certain policy incoherence marks this government's approach. On the one hand, it wants India to become a manufacturing hub, yet staying out of the RCEP reduces opportunities for trading with these countries, which together account for roughly a third of global trade. Manufacturing today requires greater integration with global supply chains. Signing the agreement would have signaled an embrace of freer trade, which could have aided in the shift of companies out of China to India. But the move has complicated India's course to integrate into global value chains. With this, India has also ceded space to China to have greater say in the region. The Economic Times, in its editorial titled Welcome Step on Bankers' Remuneration, writes, the Reserve Bank of India's decision to lay down a compensation structure for CEOs, executive directors and senior officials of private banks is welcome. It should introduce such a pay structure for public sector banks as well. RBI is right to emphasize greater weight for variable pay in the total pay and seek clawback provisions. But it has to be mindful that banks might need to draw in talent from other businesses where remuneration is not regulated. Scrapping guaranteed bonus, clawing back employee stock options, ESOPs, and slashing variable pay for extra divergence in sticky loans will encourage discipline and transparency in leveraged institutions which, as custodians of household savings, have to preserve capital to avert bailouts at the cost of shareholders and taxpayers. But rules to include ESOPs in variable pay and cap the variable pay at 3 times the fixed pay can make it tougher for banks to hire top talent, particularly non-bankers. Those were the comments from the press presented to you by the News Services Division of All India Radio.
This broadcast came to you from the Daily Station of All India Radio. And now we have for you the program